I was born in the heart of the empire, yet I have never known what it means to belong. My name is Li Xinye, daughter of Chancellor Li Wenjiao, chief advisor to His Imperial Majesty, the Son of Heaven. But to my father, I was nothing more than an ornament in his garden of ambition, a fragile bloom that existed only to be plucked and displayed when it pleased him. My earliest memories are not of laughter or lullabies, but of silence. Mother's chamber always smelled of bitter herbs. The servants whispered she had once been a commoner, a woman of warmth and softness, who had been chosen by my father in a moment of weakness. She died giving birth to me. I grew up knowing that my face carried the trace of a woman he'd rather forget. From the moment I could walk, I was taught how to bow lower than others, how to smile without speaking, how to keep my thoughts folded like hidden letters. A daughter of the Li house must be silent and perfect, my governess would say. Only silence protects you in this court. I learned quickly. By the time I turned 15, I was a portrait of obedience. My voice was soft, my steps light, my hands steady when pouring tea before guests. I thought that perhaps, if I followed every rule, my father would finally see me, not as a burden, but as a child worth loving. I was wrong. It was during the spring festival when the emperor's herald arrived. That night, the palace was alive with music, drums echoing under red lanterns, dancers swirling like petals in the wind. I stood behind the carved screen, watching from afar, when father's aide came and whispered something into his ear. His face shifted slightly, the kind of change you'd miss if you weren't desperate for his approval, as I was. After the banquet, he called me into his study. His tone was calm, but his eyes gleamed like polished jade. "You have been chosen," he said. "For what, father?" "To marry General Han Zhen, the emperor's favored commander." The words fell like stones into a pond. I stared at him, numb. "He's 12 years older," I said, softly. "Age is a matter of numbers," father replied, dismissively. "You will unite our family with the army. Do you understand what that means? You are not marrying a man, you are sealing a future." "But what of love?" I asked before I could stop myself. Father looked up, his expression a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "Love?" he repeated, almost laughing. "Love does not keep a family alive, Xinya. Power does." That night, I wept quietly behind the silk curtains of my bed. I wasn't weeping because I was afraid of the general. I was weeping because I realized that my life had never belonged to me. The wedding procession stretched from the Chancellor's Gate to the northern hills. The sound of drums followed me through every street, but I heard none of it. The veil over my face was thick, and the sedan swayed as if carrying not a bride, but a ghost. When I finally reached the general's estate, I was led to him beneath the altar's red silk canopy. He bowed, expression unreadable. "Lady Li," he said, "you honor my house." His voice was deep, steady, but distant. His eyes, gray like rain over iron, did not linger. I bowed in return, my knees trembling. The guests cheered, the wine was poured, we walked the ceremonial steps, but the moment the doors closed and the room grew silent, I realized that in this marriage I was not a wife, I was a political seal pressed onto a scroll of promises. Days passed, weeks blurred into months. Han Zhen treated me with respect, but never warmth. He spoke to me only of duty, never of dreams. He spent his nights in his study, poring over military maps. Sometimes I would hear him practicing calligraphy, each stroke deliberate, each curve shaped by discipline. There was a strange grace in it, and I often watched from the doorway without announcing myself. Once he noticed me. Does my writing amuse you? He asked. No, I said quickly. I just admire how steady your hand is. He looked at me, then at the ink. A soldier's hand must never tremble. If it does, lives are lost.
There was silence. Then he added quietly, "But sometimes I envy those who can afford to let theirs tremble." I didn't know what he meant then, but now, years later, I do. The emperor fell ill the following year, and with his sickness came chaos. The crown prince and the king of the Eastern court both claimed rightful succession. The empire split in whispers before swords were ever drawn. Father pledged allegiance to the crown prince. Han Zhen remained loyal to the king's faction. And I, caught between blood and vows, became the bridge everyone wanted to cross. One evening, Father came to visit me in secret. "You must persuade your husband," he said, pacing my chamber. "If the general supports the crown prince, we can save the empire." I said, "Father, he has sworn loyalty to the king." He snapped, "Then make him break that oath. You are his wife. Use your charm, your tears, whatever it takes." His eyes burned like fire. "Do you think I raised you for nothing?" I wanted to say that he hadn't raised me at all, but I bit my tongue. That night, I prepared dinner for Han Zhen myself, a gesture unbefitting a noblewoman. When he arrived, I spoke softly, carefully. "Have you considered the crown prince's cause?" He didn't even lift his head from his papers. "I have. And I have no intention of betraying the king." I felt my throat tighten. "My father's life depends on your choice." He looked at me then, his gaze sharp. "And what of my soldiers' lives? Should they bleed because your father fears losing his throne of influence?" "Please," I whispered, "I'm begging you." He stared for a long moment, then said quietly, "A marriage without trust is a cage. Don't ask me to lock you in it." I wanted to hate him for those words, but I couldn't, because beneath the steel in his voice, I heard pain. The first whisper came at dawn. I woke to the sound of footsteps in the courtyard, heavy boots, armor clinking softly against the pale stone. When I drew aside the curtain, I saw a line of imperial guards standing at our gate, their banners wet with morning dew. Han Zhen stood among them, his face carved in silence. My heart began to pound. I stepped outside, my robe barely tied. "What's happening?" He didn't meet my eyes. "By order of the king, your father, Chancellor Li Wenzhao, is to be arrested for high treason." I stared at him, the world narrowing to a ringing silence. "That's not possible." He handed me a parchment sealed in red wax. The wax broke beneath my trembling fingers. Inside were letters, false letters, bearing my father's seal, written to the crown prince, promising to overthrow the king. I recognized the handwriting immediately. "It's forged," I whispered. His jaw tightened. "I know." "Then stop this." "I can't," he said quietly. "If I interfere, the king will accuse me next. I'm already under suspicion for marrying into your family." "So you'll let them kill him?" "I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me?" I laughed bitterly. "By destroying the only person I have left." He took a step toward me, but I moved back. His hand dropped to his side, and for the first time, I saw something I'd never seen in him before. Fear. Not fear of death. Fear of himself. 3 days later, the trial began. The court was packed with nobles and soldiers, all waiting for blood. Father stood tall, dressed in the same ceremonial robe he'd worn when I was a child. His hair had turned white, but his pride hadn't aged a day. He looked up as they read the accusations, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. "Xingwei," he mouthed, smiling faintly. My body shook. When the judge demanded a confession, Father laughed, a laugh that echoed off marble and silk. "If I wanted to betray the empire," he said, "I would not have done it with ink." The hall erupted in murmurs. But by dusk, the verdict was decided. The king had already signed the decree. Execution at sunrise. That night, I ran through the rain to Han Zhen's quarters. He was standing at his desk, staring down at his sword, the same one he'd carried through a dozen wars. I fell to my knees. "Please," I begged, "you can stop this. You have the king's ear." He closed his eyes. "I've already spoken with him. He won't listen." "Then take me to Father. Let me see him one last time." "I can't do that either." "Why?" His voice broke then, low and trembling. "Because I'm the one who must deliver the execution order." I froze. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. "You?" He nodded, his hands shaking. "If I refuse, they'll replace me with someone who will do worse. At least I can make it swift." I slapped him across the face. The sound cracked through the silence. "Swift?" I hissed. "You think mercy makes this right?" He didn't answer. "Look at me," I said, but his eyes stayed fixed on the sword. "You're killing my father to save your own name?" And then he whispered, "I'm killing the last piece of myself." I ran from him before my knees gave way. They killed my father at dawn. The city bells tolled 3 times. Each ring was a blade in my chest. I wasn't allowed near the execution ground, so I climbed the temple hill above the square. From there I could see the pale glint of steel and the crimson banners swaying in the wind. When the sword fell, I didn't scream. I simply stood there, the cold air burning my lungs, and watched the plume of white smoke rise toward the heavens. That was the moment I stopped being the chancellor's daughter. That was the moment I became no one. The Li estate was confiscated within hours. Servants fled. The gates that once guarded honor now echoed with emptiness. Han Zhen sent me a letter. It came tied with a thin black ribbon, mourning color. It said only, "Leave the capital before the storm returns. Take the eastern road. H.Z." I burned it without reading it twice. I left the same night. No escort, no jewelry. Only a small bundle of clothes and my mother's old poetry book. For months, I wandered. Sometimes I slept in temple courtyards, other nights under bridges. My hands grew calloused, my silk robes turned to rags. There were days I hated Han Zhen with every breath, and others when I hated myself more, for still remembering the way he once looked at me beneath the lantern light. The countryside was cruel. People spat when they heard my name. "Traitor's blood," they'd say. I stopped introducing myself altogether. The court was packed with nobles and soldiers, all waiting for blood. Father stood tall, dressed in the same ceremonial robe he'd worn when I was a child. His hair had turned white, but his pride hadn't aged a day. He looked up as they read the accusations, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. "Xin Yue," he mouthed, smiling faintly. My body shook. When the judge demanded a confession, Father laughed, a laugh that echoed off marble and silk. If I wanted to betray the empire, he said. "I would not have done it with ink." The hall erupted in murmurs, but by dusk the verdict was decided. The king had already signed the decree. Execution at sunrise. That night I ran through the rain to Han Zhen's quarters. He was standing at his desk, staring down at his sword, the same one he'd carried through a dozen wars. I fell to my knees. "Please," I begged. "You can stop this. You have the king's ear." He closed his eyes. "I've already spoken to him. He won't listen." "Then take me to father. Let me see him one last time." "I can't do that either." "Why?" His voice broke then, low and trembling. "Because I'm the one who must deliver the execution order." I froze. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "You?" He nodded, his hands shaking. "If I refuse, they'll replace me with someone who will do worse. At least I can make it swift." I slapped him across the face. The sound cracked through the silence. "Swift? You think mercy makes this right?" He didn't answer. "Look at me," I said, but his eyes stayed fixed on the sword. "You're killing my father to save your own name." And then he whispered, "I'm killing the last piece of myself." I ran from him before my knees gave way. They killed my father at dawn. The city bells tolled 3 times. Each ring was a blade in my chest. I wasn't allowed near the execution ground, so I climbed the temple hill above the square. From there I could see the pale glint of steel and the crimson banners swaying in the wind. When the sword fell, I didn't scream. I simply stood there, the cold air burning my lungs, and watched the plume of white smoke rise toward the heavens. That was the moment I stopped being the chancellor's daughter. That was the moment I became no one. The Li estate was confiscated within hours. Servants fled. The gates that once guarded honor now echoed with emptiness. Han Zhen sent me a letter. It came tied with a thin black ribbon, mourning color. It said only, "Leave the capital before the storm returns. Take the eastern road. HZ." I burned it without reading it twice. I left the same night. No escort, no jewelry, only a small bundle of clothes and my mother's old poetry book. For months I wandered. Sometimes I slept in temple courtyards, other nights under bridges. My hands grew calloused, my silk robes turned to rags. There were days I hated Han Zhen with every breath, and others when I hated myself more, for still remembering the way he once looked at me beneath the lantern light. The countryside was cruel. People spat when they heard my name. "Traitor's blood," they'd say. I stopped introducing myself altogether.
I became Mei Lin, a nameless teacher in a mountain village. I taught children how to read, how to hold a brush steady, even when the wind shook the walls. In their laughter, I found something I had never known in the palace, peace that didn't demand perfection. But at night, when the wind rustled through the bamboo, I would still see my father's face. I would still hear Han Zhen's voice saying, "I am trying to protect you." Years passed. I built a small life, a humble home, a few students, a quiet heart. Then, one winter morning, an old soldier appeared at my door. His hair was silver, his uniform frayed. He bowed deeply before handing me a folded letter. "It's from General Han," he said. My breath caught. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. The handwriting was the same as the note I once burned, but slower now, weaker. "Xinyue, I do not know if you are alive.
The war has ended. The king is dead. The empire is quiet again, but I am not. I see your father's eyes every night. I have left the army. I cannot walk without pain now, and perhaps that is justice. If heaven allows it, come to the temple of White Plum at the year's end. I will wait there until the snow melts. If you do not come, I will understand. Han Zhen. I read it 3 times before setting it down. Then, for the first time in 10 years, I cried until the candles went out. The year I turned 28, I returned to the capital for the first time since my exile. The road had changed. The old city walls were cracked, and weeds had grown between the stones where soldiers once marched. The empire I'd known was gone, swallowed by time and silence. I arrived at dusk, my hair streaked with silver threads of its own. I wore no fine robes, no ornaments, only a plain cloak and a worn satchel holding the letter that had waited years for my courage. The Temple of the White Plum sat beyond the northern gate, halfway up a mountain whose slopes were still kissed by snow. The air there smelled of incense and cold stone. Bells chimed faintly in the wind. I walked the steps slowly, my legs trembling with every memory. When I reached the courtyard, I saw him. Han Zhen was sitting beneath the old plum tree, feeding sparrows with bits of rice. His hair was white, his face lined with years of silence. One leg was missing below the knee, replaced by a carved wooden limb, bound with cloth. He didn't look like a general. He looked like an old man waiting for forgiveness he no longer believed he deserved. For a long time, I couldn't move. He must have felt my presence because he turned. When his eyes met mine, the world stopped. Xingyue, he whispered. My name on his lips sounded like a prayer broken in half. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to curse him, strike him, ask him why he'd let my father die. But when I saw his trembling hands, all I felt was the weight of everything we'd both lost. He tried to rise, but his leg betrayed him. I hurried forward, instinctively catching his arm. "Don't," I said softly, "you'll fall." He looked at me with disbelief, as if unsure whether I was real. I thought, you would never come. I almost didn't, but I couldn't let the snow fall without saying what was left unsaid. He smiled faintly. The snow has been waiting too. We sat beneath the tree, silent for a long while. The plum blossoms were pale against the gray sky. Finally, he spoke.
"I have lived every day with your father's face in my mind," he said. "Every decision, every breath. I thought if I obeyed the king, the empire would survive. But I see now it was pride, not duty, that ruled me." His voice trembled. I was too afraid to be disloyal, even to injustice. I listened, my fingers tightening around my sleeve. "Do you think words can undo what was done?" "No," he said quietly, "but perhaps they can stop the bleeding." He looked at me then, and I saw the man he used to be, the soldier who dreamed of honor, the husband who never knew how to love. "I've thought of you every day," he whispered. "Not as a wife I failed, but as the one person who saw me clearly and still wished me peace." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. "I wished for peace because I needed it too," I said. "Hate is heavier than exile." He nodded slowly. "And have you found it?" I looked out at the valley below. Smoke curled from village chimneys, thin and silver.
Children's laughter floated faintly from somewhere down the mountain. "Yes," I said after a while, "but not in the way I thought I would. I found it in small things, the sound of a child learning to write, the smell of wet earth after rain, in forgiveness that no one asked for." He turned toward me, his eyes wet. "Then perhaps heaven was merciful enough to give you what I couldn't." I reached into my satchel and pulled out my mother's old poetry book. Its cover was frayed, the ink fading. I placed it between us. "She wrote this before I was born," I said. "There's a line in it I've carried my whole life. Even broken wings remember the sky." I think that's what we both forgot. Hanjen brushed the cover gently with his fingers. "I wanted the fly once," he said, "but every time I tried, I only built another cage." "Then stop building," I told him. He looked at me, a small smile forming on his tired face. "Is that forgiveness?" "No," I said softly. "It's freedom." We stayed like that until evening, talking of everything and nothing, the wars that had ended, the gardens that had grown wild, the people we'd once been. When the first snowflake fell, I rose. He struggled to stand as well, leaning on his cane. "You're leaving?" "I have children waiting for me in the mountain village. They think their teacher is brave. I should try to be." He chuckled weakly. "They are lucky to have you." "And you?" I asked. He smiled, looking up at the sky. "I have the sparrows." We both laughed, quietly, honestly, for the first time in decades. As I turned to go, he called after me, "Xinyue." I stopped. "Thank you for coming back." I didn't look back. I said, "I never left. Only the name did." The path down the mountain was long but light. The snow fell gently, covering the footprints behind me. Each step felt like forgiveness taking shape. Years later, travelers spoke of an old general who died peacefully beneath a plum tree, his sword buried beside him, his face turned toward the rising sun. They said a woman came every spring to leave a single blossom on his grave, whispering a poem before walking away. No one knew her name, but if they listened closely, they would hear the wind carry the words she left behind. "The empire took everything, but it could not take my heart." And somewhere beyond the mountains, children learned how to write her favorite line in trembling brushstrokes. "Even broken wings remember the sky." Some stories are not about victory or revenge, but about the quiet act of choosing peace after everything else is gone. She was once the daughter of power, the wife of duty, and the exile of shame, but in the end, she became something greater, a soul that remembered how to fly.